Today I wanted to talk about how long it takes to learn how to kite surf. All right, so when I was first learning to kite surf, I could never really get a straight answer on how long is it gonna take to learn to kite surf. Part of the reason is you could have a rider with wakeboarding skills and surf skills, it could take them a day. You could have a rider with no previous water sports experience and maybe no access to the water that could take months and months and months. So ultimately, it really comes down to the number of hours spent on the water. So for those of you who don't want to watch the whole video, here's my quick take. So it took me 23 hours to get to the point where I was able to ride at a beginner spot on my own. This includes lessons and some riding, everything I needed to up until this point. I did that over 16 months, and I did that over about 12 different sessions out on the water. I think most people can get out faster than I did, so stick through the end of the video. I'm gonna show you my detailed timeline, and I'm gonna talk about the mistakes I made. I'm gonna talk through each of the key phases of learning to get out there and ride, and then I'm gonna talk about some tips that should get you out on the water faster than I did. Cool, so here's my timeline, and basically you're gonna see that my timeline breaks down into 4 simple stages. Taking lessons, learning to ride upwind, learning to ride independently, and then learning to do tricks. I'm gonna talk about how long it could take you, which will be faster if you learn from some of the mistakes that I made. Step 1, let's talk about lessons. So everyone really needs to take lessons. If you put a big kite up in big wind, you could get hurt, people around you could get hurt, and so everyone really needs to take lessons to understand the basics, the safety basics, and learn how to fly a kite. What are some of the things that you'll cover in this first lesson? You would learn how to set up a kite, so how to rig it. You would learn how to launch it, how to fly it, how to do body dragging, so how the kite can drag you without the board in the water, how to do water starts with the board, how to get up and riding. And that's really usually where those lessons start to stop, is that you're able to move the kite, get up out of the water, and ride a little bit. Perfect, so let's look at my timeline. So it took me about 15 hours of lessons. I took some group lessons, I took some private lessons. So let's talk about how long it should take you. If you do a quick Google search, you'll see most people recommend between 6 and 12 hours of lessons, so I'm not that far off here. But the tips that I have is don't spread your lessons out. I had my first lesson 1 year and then my next lesson a year later. My next tip is don't necessarily jump for the group lessons because it can save you a couple of bucks. In group lessons, you spend less time flying the kite, so you spend less time learning, you learn more slowly. The next thing you could do is basically go to a very consistent wind spot so that you're making the most out of your lessons time. If you're stopping lessons because the wind's light and your kite's falling out of the sky, you're not gonna progress as fast. The last tip I have is a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about trainer kites. Does a trainer kite help? Does it make my time taking lessons more efficient? I've found that trainer kites and real kites are so different that it doesn't really give you a leg up, so I think you can skip that stage. All right, so the next step is riding upwind. When you're kite surfing, the kite is usually in front of you, the wind is usually coming from behind you, and the effect that has is you're gonna get pulled forward or you're gonna get pulled downwind. Unless you feel comfortable walking back up the beach to get back to where you started or having a car take you back up the beach, you're gonna have to learn how to ride upwind so that you can get back to where you launched. So riding upwind is a huge milestone for people that want to get out riding on their own. This skill is really a balance between a lot of different skills. So it's about understanding your speed. You want to be going fast enough, but not too fast. You want to edge your board enough to stay upwind, but not so much that you sink and drop into the water. You also need to learn to transition. You need to learn how to go from one direction back to the other direction without losing a bunch of ground. And the big thing here that I think is a surprise to a lot of people, just because you can ride upwind in one spot in a certain set of conditions, it doesn't mean you can ride upwind in all spots in all conditions. So let's take a look at my timeline again. In my particular case, it took me 25 hours of riding to get to the point where I'd been through my lessons, and then after lessons, I rode on my own, I did some supervised riding, and after about 25 hours, I felt like I was fairly confident and able to ride upwind in most situations. Now let's take a look at a typical timeline. I think a timeline that's realistic for most people if they don't make the mistakes that I made. So it could be anywhere from 15 to 20 hours for a typical rider. So I think there's some time to be saved here. And so what are my tips for riding upwind faster? The first is get the right gear. The first set of kites that I bought, they pulled like a Mack truck. They didn't have a ton of D-power, so I spent a good chunk of those 10 hours after my lessons just battling with my kites, feeling like the bar was gonna get ripped out of my hand, feeling like I was always being pulled downwind by my gear. And when I switched to my next set of kites that were just a lot more user-friendly and a lot easier, everything snapped and it just became a lot easier. So talk to your local kite shop and find out, I need a user-friendly beginner kite and I need a kite that's gonna help me get upwind more easily. Next tip after that is consider supervised riding. A lot of kite schools will offer something called supervised riding, where they'll take a boat or they'll take jet skis out with you. They'll keep an eye on you and they'll pick you up and bring you back upwind if you go too far downwind. My particular kite school, the New York Kite Center, they had an option where they would charge you $100 for every pickup. And so that was super motivating to stay upwind, to not have to do the pickup of shame, to not have to pay $100 out of pocket. And that really pushed me to learn a lot faster. But supervised riding is an interesting option that's kind of not as expensive as lessons, and you're not completely out on your own trying to figure it on your own. Last tip that I have is don't simply just go ride at the same spot over and over again and just get comfortable there. Like I said earlier, riding upwind can change depending on the conditions, depending on the wind direction, depending on the chop and the water. There's a lot of factors that go into this. And so you can really build up your confidence in terms of riding upwind by riding in different spots. All right, so the next stage is the big one, riding on your own. Total freedom, going out to a beach, launching, going out and having an incredible session, coming back to the place where you started, safe and sound and ready to ride another day. My timeline here was probably a little more stretched out than most people. I did about 8 more hours of riding before I ever felt comfortable riding at beginner spots. To be honest, I had to ride another 40 hours before I was comfortable launching in some more intermediate spots, places with tighter launches, bigger waves, strange currents. And then I rode another 60 hours after that before I basically became so confident in my ability to predict the wind, rig the right kite, pick the right board size. It took me another 60 hours before I basically was able to do all spots, including more advanced kiteboarding spots. Shifting over to a more typical timeline, it took me about 23 cumulative hours to get to the point where I was riding at beginner-friendly spots. I think most people could do this closer to 15 hours. So that's how long it took me to get to the point where I'm riding independently. Let's look at a typical timeline, something where you can learn from my mistakes and get there faster. So the first tip is pay attention in your lessons to all of the safety tips. Those safety tips are really gonna help you out if you ever get into a difficult situation later. And if you're not comfortable doing a self-rescue, if you're not comfortable handling the kite, if it backstalls and it falls out of the sky, you're not gonna be confident riding out there on your own, even at the safest beginner spot with all of your friends. So pay attention to those safety tips. Next, in your lessons and learning to ride upwind, pay attention to what kite sizes you're putting up and what different wind speeds. This is a skill where when people get on their own, they realize their instructor may have been doing this for them. And so you have to learn how to pick the kite size. So look at the local forecast, ask locals, look at what kite sizes they're picking up, take note of the different wind speeds and what works for you and what works for your weight. So the next big tip is really finding beginner-friendly local spots. And this is something that hurt me. The spots that are easily accessible around me weren't super beginner-friendly. I think if you have a spot with a big open beach, really nice shallow water, other kiters there to help you launch and land, that's gonna make it more accessible, it's gonna make it safer, and it's gonna make it easier for you to get out and riding independently. Last tip I have about this is make friends. Having people in your friend group that know how to kite, that know the local spots, it's gonna make your journey infinitely easier. Going at this alone, figuring out everything on your own, is definitely gonna make things harder. All right, so the stage that everyone started kiteboarding for. This is about jumping and doing tricks. After you're riding upwind, after you're riding independently, this is the time where immediately people start wondering, how do I get into the tricks and how do I jump? You might start with some popping, you might start with some small jumps, you might start with some jump transitions, maybe you're gonna work on a back roll. In my particular case, it took me about 46 hours of riding before I started jumping. And so let's look at a typical timeline and let's talk about what you could do to get out there to the tricks stage much faster. So first, get the right gear. Get beginner-friendly kites that ride upwind well, and get kites that jump well. There are certain big air 5-strut kites that make jumping super easy. It's kind of sheet and go power. You just lift the kite up and pull. That's gonna get you moving much faster. Next, get access to flat water. Learning to do jumps when the water is flat certainly is gonna be a lot easier than learning to do jumps in really choppy water or big waves, because it's just extra things you have to navigate at the same time. And my last tip is people never really consider going back and taking lessons again. If you take lessons for jumping from someone who knows how to do these things, or lessons for any trick, it's gonna work a lot faster than trying to figure these things out on your own. Obviously that requires some budget, and a good alternative is just watching YouTube videos. There's so much good content out there on how to do these tricks. Download these videos on YouTube, get them on your phone, take them to the beach, and use them to progress in your tricks and in your jumping. All right, so there you have it. Those are my thoughts on how long it takes to learn to kiteboard. Here's my entire timeline. It took me about 30 hours to get to the stage where I could ride independently at a beginner spot. I think you could do it faster. So here's a proposed timeline for someone looking to cut down each of the times at each of the stages. And then I'll also pop my tips back up on the screen just so you kind of have a cheat sheet, things to keep in mind that'll get you out there and riding. Remember, this isn't it. The beauty of kite surfing is there's just infinite amounts of new things to learn. After this, you start getting into advanced kite flying skills. You might get into riding a surfboard. You might get into riding a foil. You might get into riding waves. There's just so many different directions that you can go. The learning really never stops. Cool, so hopefully you found that useful. If you'd like to give me a thumbs up, if you've got questions or if I messed something out and you want to call me out on it, throw it in the comments down below. And thanks for watching.